Okay everybody, and welcome. First of all, let's have a look at how our scene is going to end up looking by the end. It's going to be something like this, with an emitter emitting our particles and a couple of force fields down at the bottom and the control of those. And when we end up going into rendered mode, we will end up with some lovely colouring done by the velocity of the particles themselves. So the material is going to take into account the speed and direction in which these are travelling. Okay, so let's go ahead, open up a brand new blend file and get cracking. Okay, so now that we're in a new blend file, what we're going to do is we're going to keep the default cube. We're going to use that as the particle eventually. And we're going to go ahead and duplicate that. And once we've duplicated, I'm going to scale it on the Z-axis by 0.1 and rename it straight away emit. This is going to be where our particles are coming from. So let's add particles to this. Now we're going to hop backwards and forwards a few times just to tweak things and get them right. And we'll make changes as we see the result of them, rather than me front loading it and just saying we're setting all of this up in a very particular way. Let's go ahead and add a particle system. Now before we do anything else, let's just press play on the timeline. If we go ahead and click play, we see that the particles are falling down. So there's our first problem to solve. Very simple. In the scene properties, we can turn off gravity. Once that check or tick is removed, we rewind. That's important. Every time you redo or change something, you have to start the animation over again. It's a physics-based animation, so it's dependent on what's come before it. Let's press play. Excellent. So now the particles are being emitted, but we can see that they're dying too soon. They're not lasting the entire animation that we've got. So we've got a couple of things we can sort out here. First of all, the length of our animation. I'm going to make it about 750. Now, I'm saying this because I know we're going to need about that many frames in this particular setup. You, if you're doing something like this yourself, may need to extend it or even shorten it depending on the settings that you end up with. Let's go to the particle system. Let's go ahead to its lifetime and also raise that to 750. Now if we rewind and press play, we will see that these particles, once they've started, they will last our entire timeline. Now they will stop being emitted at this point when they reach 200 frames. We can see that gap there. Right, these particles aren't actually doing anything at the moment. Let's, whilst we're here though, set the particles to be this cube. Now you can pick any object you want, just like the emitter here. But I'm going to keep the cube. It's nice and straightforward and simple to use. Let's go down to the render tab, go to render as object, and then I'm going to untick show emitter so that cube does not appear later on, and the instance object we're going to use is the cube. I'm then going to simply hide this out of the way, rewind and press play. And there we go, we've got a series of tiny cubes coming out and a much cleaner interface. Now, if we were to go ahead and render this at the moment, the cube would still be there. And this is something that's going to catch at least one or two of you out, and it certainly catches me out later on as well. I'm going to go to the filter up the top here. You may already have this turned on, and have this extra toggle turned on, the one of the camera, so I can enable and disable renders. And then when we go ahead, press F12 to render, that cube is no longer there. Okay, so that's all good. Now we need to add in our force fields. So I'm going to add in a force field that's just a force. We're going to go to its physics properties, and we want it to attract. At the moment, because it's got a positive force, when we press play, you will see that all of these will be pushed away from the attractor at the middle. So I'm going to call this attract straight away. I think, oh, with two T's. I think that's important to name your force fields so we know what they're doing. But this time I'm going to set it to -10. Now we will be changing this later. I know that for certain, and you'll need to change things as you go. Now, one of the great things about this is it's going to end up creating almost like a petal effect from this particular viewpoint. So you can see how using something like this, you can already get some graphics, maybe even a loading graphic or something along those lines appearing. Now, that's not where we're going to stop. But one of the things to bear in mind is that as we're adding things, tweaking this force independent of having the other force field in place is not going to result in a great thing. We need all of the forces in place. So let's go ahead and add in our second force field, which is going to be a vortex, and I'm going to name it as such as well, so vortex. Now that that's done, let's press play and see what happens, because it will be dramatically different. He says, and that looks almost the same to me, almost as if it's not taking any effect. It is having an effect on it, but not much. So let's increase the strength here to something like 5, and look at that, that's made a huge difference. I'm going to rewind and press play again, and here we go. We've got, if we look, it's kind of elliptical, and if we look at it from the side, it is going down. So we're halfway there. Let's go back to our attractor. Now I'm going to change how it's attracting. You can change the strength itself and play with that, or in this instance I'm going to turn on gravity, and what that will do is it will slow down the descent of these particles a little. These particles are now going to be attracted more and more and more the closer to the attractor they are. Now we're not quite there yet. I'm going to grab this and pull it up and out, maybe somewhere around here. Let's have a look at the distance. So yeah, X and Y around 12, that's absolutely fine. In fact, I'll put it exactly there. Now this is sending it round, and you've got this, all of the particles are just coming out at once. That's because we didn't start it from the very beginning. In fact, if I open up the timeline here, something you can pay attention to is this red line. See, at the moment everything before 194 is dark red, or bolder red, and this other red is faded. We cannot tell what this is going to look like. We cannot go backwards and forwards here because it's got no previous information. However, from 0 to 194 we can scrub that part of the timeline because it has been cached. The particle's position in the world, it knows where it should be. It's calculated up until that point, and later on we'll use that when it comes to rendering. So I need to definitely increase the strength of my attractor at this point. So I'm going to whack it all the way up to 100 and press play. Now at this point we can see it spiraling down and it looks great. I think we need a few extra things here. I think we need our emitter to emit for longer, and I think we also need to change the flow of our vortex. So we need more particles and we need them emitted for longer. So let's go and add that up as part of the setup here. So the number, I'm going to up this to 20,000. That should be plenty for this particular animation. And I'm going to increase the end point all the way to 400. Then when I go ahead and press play, not only will the animation last longer, but there'll be a thicker vortex as it goes down. Now we can see it is getting thinner and thinner as it goes down, and we can use, underneath the physics properties for the vortex, the inflow to control that. Now I found a setting between 0.5 and 1 works really well. I'm going to start at 0.5, start the animation again, and what we should find is it starts to spiral in much sooner. And here we go. So changing that inflow is going to change how quickly this ends up coming down as a point. And this is where we start getting one of our next problems that we need to deal with. So that's an awesome vortex, we can see it going down, but this turns into a mess very quickly. And the fact that it's all spinning uniformly like that, I don't like the look of that at all. I'm going to stop that, and I'm going to add in something that will kill the particles. I'm going to add in a plane. I'm going to scale it up nice and large so it will definitely hit those particles, and it is at the XY where Z equals 0, because that's where the point of our funnel of our vortex is going to. So that's where I want to kill the particles, and I'm going to add a collision layer and set it to kill particles. And just for good measure and good practice, I'm going to apply the scale of that as well. I can hide it out of the way now, and remember, hide it out of the way with the render properties as well. Otherwise, when you go ahead and render, you won't actually see anything. We won't see anything at the moment either, but we'll get to that very shortly. Okay, let's rewind. Now, as this spirals in, and if we have a look from the top, it's quite elliptical here. So I think I'm going to change my emitter strength so it's forcing out along the x-axis initially. But now we can see when it gets down to the bottom, it is stopping, which is what we want. There are a couple of things that I want to do here. First of all is the X. I want this to push out the particles much further to begin with. And then the vortex itself, I'm going to make it a bit more turbulent, because at the moment these are all very uniform. That might be a style that you want to go for, but it's not the style I want to go for. So under the particle settings, I'm going to go to velocity, and where we have object aligned, This is in the -X direction, so I'm going to type in something like -40. That is pretty good. But you can see there are some distinct gaps now in our vortex, and I want to solve that. And we can solve it in a few ways. We could move around the emitter, but that's going to cause other issues, especially if we rotate it, because its local x-axis is where it's going to be pumping out those particles from. So if we were to rotate it around its y-axis, for instance, suddenly they would be coming out vertically like that, and that, as you can see, screws up our animation. It looks cool, but it screws up what we're trying to do. Okay, so what we're going to do is go to the vortex, go to its physics properties, and here under the noise amount, I'm going to give it some noise. Now this ranges from 0 to 10, I believe, so if I type in 50, it's going to lock to 10. I'm going to try 5 to begin with and see what that looks like. Go back to the beginning of the animation and press play. Okay, that looks quite scattered now, which is pretty awesome. And look at that, that's going to... yeah, that looks really nice. Now, it might be a bit too scattered, actually, because we no longer got that really tight funnel at the bottom. So we could try and increase the inflow to tighten that up, but that's going to affect the entire thing. So I'm going to go back to 0.5 and lower my noise amount down to, let's try 3 in this case. And of course, the animation's just started over again. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. I'm quite happy with that. I want to see what the spout looks like before we move on any further. Yeah, that looks pretty good. I think if we up the number of particles as well, maybe take the inflow up just a little, but when we up the number of particles towards the end, that'll make a big difference as well. So we're almost set up now in terms of what we need in our scene in order to get everything working. The final thing, and I say final thing, I think it is the final thing, that I want to do is on the emitter itself, under the particle system, make sure that show emitter is turned off, otherwise it will appear in the render. And I want to give some randomness. Here it is, under the velocity, I'm going to give it some randomness. Now that goes quite high, and we don't want a really high randomness, because if we set it really high, like 100, what will happen is some of these will have negative velocities, and basically you end up with a big mess. Now it will eventually kind of settle into a similar position, but we end up with a really tall spout that we don't really want, as the vortex was doing earlier. So if you're going to have any randomness in there, keep it relatively low, I would say. Even as we can see 2 there is far too high, so maybe even 0.1. Playing with these settings and seeing what you get as a result is always important. In fact, at this point, that is going to have to be a lot lower if I'm going to use it. That's making a huge impact on the scene. So a little bit of randomness in there, maybe 0.05. Yeah, that looks much better. Then we've got the... yeah, nice, nice, nice. Okay, so I have my basic setup all done now. I think the next thing we'll work on is the shading. Okay, so let's hop on over into the shading tab. We're going to get rid of our principled BSDF, and we're going to add in an emission. And the reason for doing that is twofold. This will speed up our rendering a lot, because the item is emitting light. We don't need things like a lamp in our scene anymore. Let's go back to our object itself. Now, to control this emission, we are going to use an input particle info, and we're going to use the velocity here. I'm going to plug it in straight away, and it's going to go black. The reason why it's going to go black, even in rendered mode, let's turn overlays off for the moment, because this does not work in Eevee. So let's go and switch our render engine under the render properties to cycles. And there we go, we've got some color. I'll explain those colors in a few moments, and we'll sort some other bits and bobs out. Now, before we move on to playing about extra here, these rendering settings can be set really low. You will not see too much difference between 8 samples and 64 samples. It will be slightly less noisy, but we're going to use denoising to help us out here. So under the render, I would try both of these if I were you. However, I'm going to stick with optics because it's quicker for the final render. Viewport, I'm also going to set to optics as well. Not that I've got a card that can take full advantage of it, but having a less noisy environment is always a good place to be. Okay, particle info. What are we going to do here? Well, I'm going to separate out the velocity so we can get rid of this black area. This black area here is because there is negative velocity, so it's going black because we cannot represent negative numbers in the RGB space. It just turns black. But in order to sort that out, we need the absolute value. So if it goes negative, if it goes to -1, that becomes 1 instead. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's add in a separate node. So that's under converter, separate XYZ. That's what we want. We also want, in a bit, a combine XYZ. Now, before I do anything else, and you'll notice I've left a gap there between these two, so I'm actually going to save my work. If you are starting to do renders like this, it is a good idea to make sure you save your work before you... Oh, I've saved it as Untitled. I'll rename it in a bit. But it is important you save your work during the rendering process. That's likely, more likely anyway, that Blender will have a crash. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to add a converter math node in, and it will automatically go into place. And I'm going to set this to absolute. Now, by setting it as absolute, all of the values where they are red turn red, which is great. Now we can link up the Y to the Y and the Z to the Z, and of course you can play around with these if you want, but then I can take the absolute value that we've got there, duplicate it twice, and there we go. We've got ourselves colors, which is pretty awesome. These colors here are driving, or rather the velocity itself is driving the color of our vortex here. The final thing I'm going to do, rather than playing around with different settings in here and different maths nodes, I'm going to go to the color settings and the hue and saturation, and this here is going to enable me to change the color to that lovely purpley blue at the top and the yellow at the bottom that I really like. Of course you can play with this yourself. You can even turn up the saturation, make it really bright and bold. And here we go. This is the basic node layout that we're going to need in order to get this working. Now, I don't know if there is a vector mathematics node that will do the absolute values. If you do know about that, please do let me know down in the comments. I'm still learning about vector mathematics. It really mushes my brain up when I try. Right, for the moment anyway, we're all learning. So there's the basic node setup. We're taking the velocity, which is a vector, so there's 3 components to it there, a vector 3, and those are the X, Y, and Z coordinates. We're making sure that they're all positive and then combining it back together again. We're then passing it through a hue saturation value node, and that gives us a bit more control over the overall color. And of course you can do other blends in here as well if you wanted to. I don't want to do anything further with that, and you can certainly end up with some very interesting effects if you use the other parts of the particle info here, perhaps the age as well. Now remember that the age, if you were to use that, or the lifetime's fixed anyway, but the age of a particle obviously is going up, and it starts at 0 and ends at 750 when the timeline finishes. And one of the issues with that, of course, is the value 0 to 750. You're going to have to normalize it down to 1 before you can use it effectively in most of this chain. But that's also possible to do. Right, I think we're done with the shading setup, and it's time to set up the camera. Let's go back to the layout view. Let's look through the camera. This is what we're going to see at the moment. If we hit F12 to render, we can see our cubes. Okay, let's go ahead, and I can see straight away I'm going to have to make some optimizations for my rendering. So let's put the camera in position first. So I'm going to use Shift and the tilde key to go all the way up. I'm going to use Q and E to adjust my view. Now I want to try and frame it so that the entire thing is in the view, like so. That looks good to me. I'm just going to press play there. Yeah, that looks really good. I'm going to go ahead and add an empty to my scene. What I want to be able to do is rotate around this funnel, and it will give the effect, because we cannot see any of the background, that it is rotating around rather than us. So I've got my empty in the scene. I'm going to go to my camera, and whilst holding down Shift, I'm going to drag it on top of the empty. This will set the camera as a child, or the empty as a parent of the camera. Now what I can do is I can go into that empty, and we're going to key in the rotation so it's locked in at 0, and then we're going to adjust by the end frame 750. Let's move to it. Do I want to rotate once or twice? Let's do twice, because I've done once in all the other renditions of this. I'm going to do 700, it's going to be 720, 360 times 2. There we go. So now, as we go ahead, key that in and press play, the camera is going to rotate around our scene. And this will make it look like that the emitter itself is rotating around rather than us. Now I'm just having a look at that. If I pause that for a second, using the handle at the lower part of the timeline, I can zoom out on the timeline, and you'll notice that at the very beginning, this side of it is off. You see that? That's outside of the bounds of the camera. However, when we're around the other side, we're nowhere near that. So we can still offset the camera just a little. So I'm going to grab the camera and I'm going to play by going shift and tilde again. I'm just going to pan across, pressing the D key a couple of times, and then I can just watch that back again. It doesn't change the simulation. It's just outside there, still inside here. So I can do the same thing again. Going back to frame 1, and let's pan across a little. Click to select and press play. Now hopefully we've got some of the particles just hitting the edge here and some just hitting the edge here. I think that is good enough for what I want to do at the moment. So we've got this counter rotation here. I don't know, probably can be improved a little bit further. Whoa, and look at that, something broke down with the particles. Right, I'm quite happy with the actual setup we've got here, and that sudden explosion of the particles is the cache going funny. That sometimes happens. Don't worry about it. We need to go back to our emitter and play with our particle system. Now, one thing we've not done yet, we can see it happened at 381 frames, is we haven't baked our particles. And this is something that I'd always recommend before you go ahead and render it, because it prevents something like that from happening. Once you bake it, it's like solidifying the result of the physics simulation, which also means that it will run quicker if it was more complex. Before I go ahead and bake this, I'm going to go ahead into the physics properties, or sorry, the particle system, not the physical properties. I'm going to up this to 50,000. I'm going to make sure there are lots of particles. This isn't something that in general I've found works particularly well with children particles or child particles. Now I'm going to click bake, and it's going to take a few moments to go through and bake in the position of the particles. Now this is great because it's going to mean that we can scrub backwards and forwards on the timeline. However, we will have to delete bakes if we need to make any changes. You will notice now that all of this is grayed out. So in order, if we wanted to change things again, we'd have to delete the bakes to change any of this information. And that makes sense because we're taking that physical those physical calculations and converting them into positional information. Now this can end up using a lot of RAM on your computer if you're not careful or you have very large scenes. But now I'm able to scrub my entire timeline and see the entire result of the render, which is really, really useful. Okay, or rather of the simulation we've not rendered yet. I think that's the next thing we need to start setting up. Okay, so rendering. Now this is interesting. I would recommend when you're setting up for rendering, having a low render count. I need to do a bit of optimization here. I'm going to use my GPU to render, so it'll be a bit quicker. Denoising still set to optics, fine. The denoising here on the start sample, I'm going to increase that so it only happens at the end of this, so it's a bit smoother in the viewport. Now, because I'm using the GPU, it's going to favor larger tile sizes. So I'm going to go down to the performance tab and turn these two values, click and drag there, to something like 256. And then when I go ahead and render it, it's going to be significantly quicker. Now, we can't actually see anything at the moment, what is going on there, because we're on frame 0, which isn't part of our animation. So let's make sure we're at a good stage in our animation, which is one of the great things about baking, and we can go ahead and just render that out. That's perfect. That is exactly what I was looking for. Now we can start to think about some extra bits and bobs that we may want to include in our render. So one of the things that we can do is include motion blur. If I go ahead and click that, it will increase our render time. That's something to bear in mind, but there are other optimizations that we can do that will hopefully sort that out. Whilst that's building the render kernels, few minutes at the first time. That's fine. We can go back over to these settings. I'd like to discuss the output settings because these can change your render time significantly, and ultimately, because we're rendering out an animation, you really want to pay attention to these. So first of all, your resolution. I'm going to share this on social media. I'm going to render it high quality for this particular video, but in general I would opt for something like 720p, which is 1280 by 720 is the resolution. In fact, I'm going to stick with that even for this because it's going to be so much quicker. Further down here we've got our frame start, frame end. That's fine. And then we have our step. Now our step in this particular case means that it's going to render every frame. If we set that as, let's say, 24, it will render every 24th frame, which is really useful when you're testing out a render. The number of times I've seen people who have rendered something, said this took all night, and they come back and something's broken. Well, if you render every second, every half second, maybe even every 2 seconds, well, that means that you can quickly eyeball your entire animation. In fact, I might do that in a few moments. Let me go and find the rendering tab. Here we go. So this is the rendering tab, and it's now got, as you can see here, motion blur included. Now that's something we can play with here, the shutter speed. So if it's set to 0.5, that means it's going to be, in this case, 1/12 of a second shutter speed. So if I lower that down and re-render, we will see that that will be a lot less. There will still be a bit of a smudge there because these things are whizzing around, but it will be quite sharp. If I go all the way up to 1, that will be 1/24 of a second, so we'll end up with nice big streaks. Now that's pretty cool. I think I'm going to stick with that. Yeah, I'm definitely going to stick with a higher shutter speed. I'm probably not that high though, maybe 0.8 or so. Rolling shutter, I'm not going to deal with that at the moment. Rolling shutter will make it skew. Great if you're trying to match moving footage, but in this case I think it won't add anything to our scene because the camera, even though it's rotating, isn't really moving, so I wouldn't thought we'd see any rolling shutter anyway. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Okay, so I think I'm almost ready to start rendering out, but I want to do some compositing first. I've got the framing sorted. You know what, before we do the compositing, one final thing is the world itself. I don't want a light grey world, I want a dark world with maybe a hint of blue in it instead. I really want this vortex to stand out by itself. There we go, that's much better. Okay, so let's talk about compositing. So whilst we're in the compositor, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn on use nodes. We can see this is the render that we've just done. So the render will come through and then some stuff will happen to it and we'll end up with a composite, which is just a combination of stuff being put together. I'm going to use a glare node, and that is under the filter, glare. I'm going to pop that in, and we can't see what's going on at the moment. We need something called a viewer node. So let's go ahead and add in an output viewer. Now when we plug this in, all of a sudden it appears in the background. That's far too sparkly for my liking. I'm also going to set the number of streaks to 6. So it's more hexagonal, more star-like as we go there. And then it's just a matter of playing with all of these settings until you get something you like the look of. I'm certainly going to whack down the fade so it's not so bright on the scene. These streaks aren't quite so big. And I've found that playing with the mix, if you whack it up quite high, you can see it ends up quite smudgy. You can move these out of the way or zoom out and put them up in the corner if you want to, using the middle mouse button to move around there. We can turn the mix back down again. We can play with the threshold. So when is this happening? I could turn it up to 40 and you won't see it. If I turn it up to 4, it gets much dimmer. If I turn it all the way down to 0, it means that everything will be affected by this. And of course we can play with these other settings as well. Color modulus is kind of cool. It gives this dispersion effect around everything. Again, it all depends on kind of the style you're going for, and I would encourage playing with these settings. There's going to be no right or wrong in this particular case, and I'm just dialing in some figures that I kind of like the look of. And remember, this is going to be slightly blurred as well, so maybe you want to turn down your motion blur to get it more on point. So if I turn motion blur off and just re-render our scene, you will have to re-render. It'll be nice and static like this, and then look, it looks completely different to how it looked before. It hasn't quite updated over here. It's still a bit swirly. So this has a much more pointiness or twinkliness to it than the other option, and that will persist as well. Turning motion blur on, it will smooth out and it will have less of those twinkles, shall we say, in it, because there will be less of those really bright areas we can see here. Now the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another glare node, so I'm going to use Shift and D to duplicate. I'm going to link that up to the composite as well. But this time, instead of using streaks, I'm going to use fog glow. By using fog glow, this is very much like using bloom in Eevee. And again, time to tweak these. So if you want slightly less around, we can change the size. So if I go down to maybe 7, it's very, you know, there's a big difference there. I think this is integers only. Yep. So I want a 7 there, and perhaps playing with the mix here, if I take it up to 0.8, we can see that's a bit different from if we go backwards a little. And again, tweaking this so that it suits what you want from it. I mean, the possibilities here are endless, and I could play with it for hours, and I literally have played with it for hours. So I do want a lower mix in this particular case, because otherwise it gets rid of the twinkles I had. So let's go all the way down to 0.1. Yeah, I quite like that. And maybe turn up the glow and then lower the threshold. No, it's increased the threshold. I'm going to go for 2 in this case. So there's going to be less, even more. Yeah, there we go. That's a nice bit of bloom around the really bright areas. That's what I wanted. Okay, so that's our compositing setup. Of course, you can play with many other options in here. One of the other ones that I do like including, so I will include it here before we move on, is the curves. I'm not sure what this is under. It might be under color. RGB curves. Excellent. And again, remember to plug it into your composite as well. With this, we can adjust things like the contrast, so we can make everything kind of brighter, I suppose, by turning that up, or we can make it bend the other way, or you can play with these curves and end up with completely different feelings of your entire scene. Now, I do like playing with curves, but again, I don't want to get too bogged down in it. I'm going to have a slight curve here, which is going to make the background ever so slightly darker. Okay, so now that that is done, I think it's time to set up for rendering. Okay, so saving our work before we go, the first thing I want to do with the rendering is go to the Output tab. By going to the Output tab, it's going to enable me, once Blender's finished saving, there we go, it's going to enable me to set this step size. I am going to do 48 in this case, and I'm going to go ahead straight away and go Control F12. Now Control F12 will start rendering each frame of our animation, and we've jumped literally 2 seconds at a time here, so we're only going to be rendering out maybe 15 or so frames if my calculations are roughly correct. But looking at the entire animation is really important. It's very easy at this stage to go, yeah, everything looks brilliant, and you end up rendering something out and it ends up broken at some point during the animation. And this is going to be a relatively short animation, considering it's even done with cycles. Because we've got the emission there, we don't need to calculate too much in the way of light, which is really useful. But what we will end up with is a full idea from the beginning to the end how the animation is going to look. And I can't impress upon you guys how much that's going to save you time in the long run. It feels like I'm wasting time. I'm rendering stuff that I'm never going to use again. Or am I? There is a technique we could have used if we're not going to make any other changes that would have allowed us to keep these 30 odd frames that we're rendering here. And this will also give us an idea of total render time that we're going to be expecting. So we're averaging around 5 to maybe 5.5 seconds per frame of render. And we've got 750 to do. So we're maybe looking at about, in fact, I'm going to calculate it quickly. Yeah, so we're looking at about 62 minutes worth of rendering at the moment. Now I will be rendering out as images across multiple computers just to save myself the headache and time of waiting for everything. So I'm going to go ahead here. I'm going to make sure I save my work. It is important to save quite regularly as you're making these changes, because if you're like me and going to render it across this computer and another computer that you're working on, you want to make sure that everything's bang up to date. Now I've saved my work on a NAS. I'm going to go to my render and view the animation. Now this will be very, very jerky. It'll essentially be 2 frames per second. No, half a frame per second, because we're rendering it out. And we can see here how it's balanced in the frame over the entire thing. It's still slightly leant over to the left side, but otherwise that looks pretty neat. And then we can see it winding down. And luckily it also has the right timings. We're not seeing all of those frames lumped together. We're seeing them spread out properly over the right time. There we go. So that was only 49 frames that we've rendered out. So I'm happy with everything there. Let's go ahead and set up ready for the render. The output folder, I would always recommend that you are rendering out to a specific folder. And when it comes to rendering, I've already done a render, as you can see here, for the intro slide. I'm going to call this animation. There we go. I'm going to go into that folder. That's where I'm going to be rendering. Now, when it comes to any sort of animation, please render out as a PNG. In a previous iteration of this, I had to stop because I needed my computer for something. I would not have been able to do that if I was rendering out directly as a movie. It saves you so much time. Do you need the alpha channel? Probably not. So let's go RGB. That will save us a bit of space. Maybe even up to a quarter space as well, because we've not got one of those channels there. Everything else, well, we're not going to overwrite anything, but we do want placeholders there, so as we're rendering, it works as expected. I'm going to save my work again, and I'm just going to consider, oh, I need to change my step size back to 1. That's important. I'm going to consider my resolution. I think that's okay, and of course this will actually run a lot faster on my laptop, which has got a 20 series NVIDIA graphics card, and it's going to be a bit faster with the denoising stage. I think I'm happy with everything there. I'm going to set this down to 1 and save once more. So that is ready to render out, and the settings are going to be the same across all of my computers, so they know to look for the Z drive, Blender, etc. Now, if you don't have access to a NAS or anything like that, you could use Google Drive or even Dropbox. Providing the usernames on the different computers are the same, you shouldn't have any problem with that. They will go to your user directory, your username, etc. Okay, I think I'm ready to start rendering. So this is the process that's going to take probably about 20 minutes in total, including the other computer, and I'll see you guys back shortly. Okay, brilliant. So we're all done. Let's go ahead and view the render. So view animation, make it full screen. That's playing back the first one at the moment by the looks of it. That's not what we want. I think it's going to start playing the proper one back in a moment when this is finished. Yeah, there we go. So let's have a look at how that's going. That's awesome. So we've got this spinning round. So this part here is being chased around. The funnel is coming down. Oh, that is lovely. Awesome. Now, if you've made one of these yourself, please do share it. I'd love to see what you ended up with. That's awesome. So that's going to disappear now. And yeah, so the next thing to do is to actually make this into a movie. As we can see at the top here, it's just playing through the pictures at the moment. So let's get rid of that, bring open Blender. It's already saved, so I'm going to open up a new blend file. I always do this for rendering out so that I don't end up with basically a timeline full of images and can't work out why things aren't rendering as they're supposed to be. So I'm going to open up a new video editing workspace. I'm going to go add image sequence. I'm going to go to the appropriate location. So that's in here, animation. Now make sure these are in the right order. They're in the reverse order. You'll get a reverse animation. I'm going to press A to select everything and add image strip. And then when we press play, it should play that back, which it is doing. Perfect. Before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's set the end to 750 frames. Excellent. And now let's go scroll down, output. So again, we're going to select our folder, make sure we select an appropriate one. And I'm going to output as an FFmpeg. It's going to be encoded using MPEG-4 so we can see it. You could also use QuickTime, that works on a lot of systems. I'm going to go to MP4, video codec H.264, output quality, I'm going to go for high quality, encoding speed, good, real time, slowest. I'm going to go to slowest because I want the best compression of efficiency. Because we've got quite a dark scene, that will mean that we end up with some artifacting around the edges of our vortex if we're not careful. So with all of those settings done, it's just a matter now of going render animation. Now this will be a lot quicker than the original animation. It's almost real time, not quite, but it's going through incredibly quickly. And then we'll have a movie made. Okay everybody, so congratulations. Around me now somewhere there will be the 3 different renders that I've done playing with all of the various settings, and I can't wait to see yours. So if you do, shout me out in the comments at me so I can see it, over on TechEd Mike as well on Twitter. Share it over there, and if you've liked the video, of course give me a like, and if you want to see more like this, remember to subscribe to the channel so you can see more. Okay guys, take care, looking forward to seeing yours, and I'll see you in the next one.